In this conversation, we ask him about survival, memory, and what it really means to say never again. Mr. Kapos reflects on the moral duty to speak out, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Thank you.
What you can see on day to day on your screens makes it absolutely clear that it is a genocide. All the Israeli politicians had pretty much made statements, signaled that that was their intention. Sometimes the most difficult thing to prove about a genocide is intent. In this case, it is overwhelmingly clear. As they promised, they said they would turn Gaza into a parking lot, and that's pretty much happened. That what I saw in Budapest was the byproduct of two armies fighting. But what I see in Gaza is deliberate, one-sided destruction, extremely cruel, and it's only a matter of time. And I'm afraid this goes for Israel as well, as a state as it is now. It cannot continue as an apartheid state with a Zionist government as it is now. And I very much admire the young students who demonstrate outside the US embassy sometimes on their university campuses, and run the risk of being arrested and blighting their future job prospects, etc. And they accept that risk. And I think that is heroic.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Gaza Stories. I am Muneef Khan. Today, I'm speaking with Stephen Kapos, an 88-year-old Holocaust survivor who was a child when he went into hiding during the Nazi occupation of Hungary. He was saved by people who chose courage over fear. And that experience has shaped the way he's thought about moral responsibility all his life. Now, almost 80 years later, Mr. Kapos is using his voice to speak out about what's happening in Gaza. For him, the lessons of the Holocaust aren't just about the past, they're a call to conscience in the present. He has spoken publicly about how his Holocaust survival experience informs his view on other conflicts, particularly his strong solidarity with Palestinians and criticism of the Israeli government's policies. Mr. Kapos was also summoned by the Metropolitan Police in the UK after he attended a pro Palestine protest this year in London, where he laid flowers remembering the Palestinians killed in the genocide. In this conversation, we ask him about survival, memory, and what it really means to say never again. Mr. Kapos reflects on the moral duty to speak out, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Kapos.
Thank you for inviting me.
My first question, and this is more to do when you were a child. You were a child in hiding during the Nazi occupation of Hungary in 1944. When you look back now, what moments or impressions from that time stand out most vividly to you? What did you learn about fear, humanity, and indifference from the situation around you?
Well, I was 7 years old when this was happening to me, because the German army invaded Hungary and Budapest in March 1944. It was towards the end of the war, and the reason for the invasion of their ally, because formally Hungary was allied to Nazi Germany, because the Hungarian leadership was very right-wing and autocratic, and could be described as semi-fascistic. So they made a natural ally to Hitler, and also they were promised return of territories lost in the First World War. It was partially, Hungary was bribed into joining Germany in the war. But by the end, and 1944, Germany was, it was clear that they were being beaten by the Soviets, particularly the Western Allies also, but they have lost great battles on the Eastern Front. And the Hungarian leadership started to make feelers out to the Western powers to see whether they could leave the German alliance, and on what terms would that be acceptable to the Allies. And this was discovered by the German intelligence, and Hungary became unreliable as an ally, and that's why the invasion occurred in March. But the government, for a period, remained in place, the Hungarian government of Admiral Horthy. He was the regent. He couldn't found a dynasty or become a king because he wasn't Roman Catholic. According to Hungarian constitution, he would have had to be Roman Catholic. Anyway, by about October 44, even he had realized that something needed to be done and made a proclamation in the radio to say that Hungary was leaving the alliance and changes its status to neutral. And it was then, on that day, that it so happens, coincidentally, that I was taken up into these protected, inverted commas, homes, which were organized to hide Jewish children. And the cover was that we were meant to be Aryan refugees from the advancing Russian troops from the Eastern Front, and some of us even to be war orphans. So I was being taken up into this home by an emissary who was sent down for that purpose, actually the gardener of the place where we had our first center established. It was in the area close to the royal castle, a very posh area of the Buda Hills. The Danube River divided Budapest into Buda and Pest. Buda was hilly, Pest was flat. And we were taken up into this, into one particular villa, which was donated by its owner for the purpose. As I was taken up, I was still small enough to be carried in arms by this gardener. And I clearly remember passing a German checkpoint, because, as I said, it was the day of the proclamation. The German army suddenly started to train their guns, field guns, on the castle which is topped by a palace, a medieval castle with thick walls, but on top of it there was a relatively modern palace complex. And we had to go past this German checkpoint, which was quite easy because the person who carried me had some magical piece of document that when he flashed to the German guards, they stood to attention and saluted and waved us through. I don't know what. I fantasized that there was a piece of paper which carried Hitler's signature, maybe. But it had immense effect on the German guards. So we had no problem. I got up to this place, and from there on, I was looked after by one of my aunts, who also had her two sons, older than me, in this group. Boys and girls were divided, and I was with a boys group led by this aunt of mine, Aunt Ergi, who we were not allowed to recognize as a relative. Everything was hush-hush, and there were no relationships allowed or recognized according to the false papers that we all had. So that's one of my memories, this going past the Germans. It was October, so we arrived at this palatial villa, which was donated by the family Hagemacher. They had, I guess, German-Swiss connections, And the family at the beginning of the war left Hungary for their Swiss to join their Swiss relations, just to avoid any trouble. They weren't Jewish, but they did donate their vacated palatial villa for the purpose of saving the Jewish children. It so happens that the leader of our group, whose name I mentioned earlier, Gabor Stelo, who is now recognized to be a hero of the war, or particularly of the Holocaust period, he was a cousin of this Hagemacher family, so they kind of trusted him and donated this wonderful villa. When I arrived, it was amazing. It was like arriving to a minor palace. And then we were divided into different groups and dispersed into other locations. That was the beginning of the rescue mission. But initially, it was aiming at by the Lutheran Protestant Church towards those Jews who converted to Christianity under the pressure of the difficult legislation. A lot of Jews converted to Christianity as a means of escaping the impact of these racist laws. But that only lasted, its beneficial effect only lasted for a very short time, and soon it just didn't matter whether you were converted or not. But this Good Shepherd initiative by the Lutheran Church started to aim at the Jews who were converted, but under the leadership of this very humanitarian Gabor Stelo, it was extended to anyone who needed protection. And with the support of the Swiss Red Cross, who had another brave emissary by the name of Friedrich von Born, together they kept organizing more and more homes, both in Buda and the Pest side as well. And eventually, they had saved altogether 2,000 children during this period. There is now a monument erected for his memory in central Budapest, outside the central Lutheran church in Deák Square. Interestingly, it's a very fine monument, semi-abstract, designed by one of the boys Stelo saved, who became a much recognized, well-known sculptor, Tamás Vig. And so anyway, going on with memories, that was in October. By about December, fighting was approaching our area. The Pest side of Budapest was already conquered by the advancing Soviet forces. But they couldn't cross the river because all the bridges were blown up by the Germans. And so there was a delay factor. When it came to Christmas, it was, I could call it the eve of the fighting. It was, the Soviets were getting closer and completely surrounded the town by then. And we, nonetheless, the German army always celebrated Christmas wherever they were, in good times and bad times. Christmas was so important for them. So even on the eve of the final fighting, they had pronounced a Christmas celebration and invited us, our Jewish children, not knowing that we were Jewish, to be their guests for Christmas. And of course, our leaders, adults, could not refuse this, because that would have been revealing something. So I remember that Christmas dinner with the German army, which was a very beautifully sat, long white table. And for each setting, there were little fir twigs marking places. And we were seated alongside one German soldier, one Jewish boy, one German soldier, one Jewish boy, all the way on both sides of this table. And at the end, there was a nicely decorated Christmas tree, and hung from above a big swastika flag. So that was the situation. And strangely enough, despite the fact that by that time supplies were very difficult because all shops closed, it was a wartime situation, I can't remember what they offered for the meal. But I do remember that my atmosphere was extremely depressed because quite clearly we were there for the Germans to be reminded of their family. And they realized that their chances of rejoining their own family were very slim because in the coming fighting, they were the underdogs by a long way. The Soviets were much more numerous and better equipped by that time, better supplied. And they were either going to fall in fierce fighting that was to follow, or taken, captured as war captives and taken to the Far East into the gulags. And the survival rate there was about 10%.
And if I may bring the question, because you did mention about your childhood memories, and uh, I wanted to bring the question now to Gaza because you've described what's happening in Gaza as a genocide, and I wanted to
Yeah.
ask what leads you to that conclusion, and how do you think the term genocide should be understood or used in public discourse today?
Well, the International Court of Justice had already examined a detailed submission by South Africa about the claim that this was a genocide, and they came to the preliminary conclusion, some 15 judges with a big overwhelming majority, that it was a plausible genocide. They couldn't go further because examining all the evidence and calling witnesses, etc., is a very long process, and sometimes it takes several years. And you have to make a preliminary judgment, not waiting like the British government is waiting on the final word of the court. Because if you do that, you can never prevent a genocide. You employing that kind of attitude would simply make a retrospective judgment to say, yes, yes, it was a genocide. I'm terribly sorry, and nothing left. And that isn't a workable position. And I take much more notice of other independent bodies, international bodies, the United Nations, the rapporteur, Francesco Albanese, and others, B'Tselem and others, who have all come to the conclusion that it is a genocide. And quite simply, what you can see on day to day on your screens makes it absolutely clear that it is a genocide. Also, at the beginnings of it, that all the Israeli politicians had pretty much made statements that signaled that that was their intention. So where it is sometimes the most difficult thing to prove about a genocide is intent. In this case, it is overwhelmingly clear because of their own statements, including the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense at the time, I forget his name now, and the President. They all made statements that made it clear, and of course their behavior was consistent with that. It was quite clearly sort of mass punishment of the civilian population by bombardment, by starvation, and cutting off life essentials. The systematic destruction of that environment to make life impossible to continue or restart there. As they promised, they said they would turn Gaza into a parking lot, and that's pretty much happened. I go back to my experience in Hungary, and as I said, Christmas was just the eve of the final fight. But then the final fight did occur, and we were in the middle of it. And because we were close to the Royal Castle complex, where the final stand was, and around it. And when it was over, and when we came out and could look around, the devastation was horrific. Piles of rubble and burnt out vehicles, dead bodies strewn about, abandoned munitions, helmets. I remember the whole scene was just absolutely horrific. I have to emphasize, this was not typical of Budapest as a whole. It was in this final fight area that this has happened. Now, that was very similar to what I see in Gaza as a resultant environment. But there is this big difference, that what I saw in Budapest was the byproduct of two armies fighting. But what I see in Gaza is deliberate, one-sided destruction, extremely cruel, because it affects all hospitals, or most of the hospitals, schools, particularly. They aim at these public buildings, schools, mosques, even Christian churches, everything that sustains life. Universities. I've seen footage of them systematically blowing up a university which was already conquered. There were no Hamas or anything there. There was no excuse, but they systematically blew the place up. And I think it's unprecedented cruelty. So that is this actual parallel with the experience that I've had.
And if I may interrupt, and this is to do with the phrase never again. The phrase never again has been invoked in many different ways since the Holocaust as a universal call for peace and coexistence. But I wanted to ask, has your understanding of that phrase changed over the years? And
Yeah.
what do you think it truly demands of Jewish
Yeah.
society today?
Okay, there are two interpretations of that same phrase, and it used in two different senses. Those who survived the Holocaust and were absolutely horrified at the degradation of human spirit that allowed it to happen were determined to join politics and all activity to prevent anything like that occurring again. Never again was the slogan arising from that. And it is on that basis that the United Nations was established to prevent anything like that happening again. So that's one interpretation of never again. And it is in this sense that the recurring big demonstrations use this phrase. We keep saying never again, not in our name. At the same time, the Zionist project and Israel is using never again as a excuse, as a kind of justification. It's a reference to the Holocaust, the immense, undoubtedly unique suffering, or almost unique. There have been others more recently, of the Jewish people, and they use this enormous suffering as a excuse and a justification for impunity, that we suffered so much that we cannot be taken to account for anything we might do. It's all justified with that terrible event. And not long ago, Netanyahu was using the term, saying at a speech he made at Yad Vashem, saying never again is now, making a link to their current punitive action and genocide at Gaza back to the Holocaust. That in fact, it is just ensuring that we don't get, we have a right to defend ourselves, which is completely distorted. It was nothing to do with defense, what they have been doing in Gaza, or even to do with freeing hostages or destroying Hamas. It was ethnic cleansing, in my opinion.
And if I may ask, and this is more to do with the politics of remembrance, you've spoken about how the Holocaust remembrance can sometimes be misused to justify oppression rather than prevent it. In your view, what distinguishes remembrance that honors the past from remembrance that distorts or weaponizes it?
Well, well, as I described earlier, the meaning of it, that you can use the memory of it as a terrible example which must never be repeated against any people, and it could be used, as I said, as justification for horrors committed today by a distorted philosophy, the Zionist policies and practice. That's a big difference. I illustrate this with one example that I've seen not long ago. There was a session of the United Nations. And when it came to the Israeli ambassadors to the UN's turn to speak, before he started, very theatrically, he put on a yellow star, making a reference to the Holocaust, clearly linking the Holocaust experience to their justification, which he was about to talk about for their current actions. And I was watching this as somebody who had to wear the yellow star. Although I was only 7 years old, all members of my family had to wear the yellow star. And it is a horrible othering, victimization. And I was sickened by this symbol and this awful memory to be used in a completely distorted way to justify ongoing atrocities committed by the Israelis. So that's an example of how it's being misused.
And if I may ask, as a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, you've often faced criticism for speaking out against Israeli government policy. How do you navigate balancing your Jewish identity, the memory of the Holocaust, and the decision to speak according to your conscience on the genocide in Palestine?
Well, I see no contradiction. Um, it's it's uh, it's a separate thing. The meaning of being Jewish is really adhering partly to the Judaism, which is a very peaceful creed and has nothing to do with Zionism and Israel itself. A good friend of mine, Professor Rashid, who is an Israeli, said there is nothing Jewish about Israel because their whole ethos is not peaceful, but the opposite, and oppression and atrocities, and lack of justice, etc. So I also, my background is not particularly religious. Some members of my family had who, but one particular branch of my family who were forcibly, if you like, or under pressure, converted to Christianity. They became genuine Christians. And one particular aunt I can think of who ended up living in Israel because she was a Transylvanian, and Transylvania was reattached to Romania, and the Romanian communist system allowed Jews to emigrate out of the country, but only to Israel, because they had a deal going with the Zionists, who were paying so much for so much per head for every Jew that was allowed to leave for Israel. So they left for Israel, a number of them. When I visited them, I found that this particular aunt I can think of, who was quite elderly by then, was still Christian in her beliefs, genuine Christian, but at the same time a Zionist and tolerant about the awful treatment of the Palestinians. And I found that very difficult to understand. Generally, I particularly after what has happened in Gaza, or is happening, and hasn't stopped despite the ceasefire. I mean, I never heard of a ceasefire where you can continue bombing, which is what they do. I've sort of written off, in my mind, written off Zionism, because they had, with their action, so condemned themselves that they have left no moral basis to continue. And it's only a matter of time. And I'm afraid this goes for Israel as well, as a state as it is now. It cannot continue as an apartheid state with a Zionist government as it is now. It's only a matter of time, but all this will change.
And if I may ask about bearing witness in the present, you said before, and I quote, silence in the face of injustice carries its own kind of guilt. What does bearing witness mean to you now, as one of the few remaining voices from that generation?
Yeah, I am very conscious of what was happening during the Holocaust in my country, in Hungary. The large number, the overwhelming masses of people had some idea of the awful things and the injustice that was going on in relation to the Jewish population. But they all had personal interests to protect, and they did not take, typically, they did not take any risks. to speak up or in any way resist, except for a few heroes who did. And that was outstanding how noble some were. I can particularly think of a family friend who was not Jewish, by the name of Emil Wiesmeyer, who was a printer. He had printing works. And during the night, at great risk to himself, he was printing false protection papers for Jews to claim that they say they also had dual citizenship, Spanish citizenship or something like that. I'm just bringing that up as an example. Immensely dangerous activity. If he had been discovered, he would have been summarily executed. But there were people like that.
And
Very few, very few. And it's extremely important for their example to be followed and to realize that in certain times there is no excuse. You have to take risks. And I very much admire the young students who demonstrate outside the US embassy sometimes on their university campuses, and run the risk of being arrested and blighting their future job prospects, etc. And they accept that risk. And I think that is heroic. Older people like myself don't have much to risk, quite honestly.
And if I may ask about the incident with the police in the UK, you were reportedly interviewed, that's the word they've used, by the police in the UK over your comments on the genocide in Gaza. But I wanted to ask, what does this say about the climate of free speech and moral dissent today, especially when survivors like yourself continue to face active censorship?
Yeah. Incidentally, I just want to correct something. The reason why I was interviewed was because I disobeyed police orders to not to march on a particular date. I was part of a delegation which did walk, we claim, not march, despite the police order to stay static at a particular place. And it was for that I was eventually interviewed under caution, with a prospect of maybe being arrested later for it. But they didn't proceed with things. I just had a lengthy interview. And I had a wonderful solidarity demonstration outside the court, outside the police station while this was going on. So altogether, it was more a positive experience than a negative one for me personally.
And if I may ask, but what does this say about the climate of free speech, especially when
Well,
survivors like you?
I think we are all conscious of a tendency, a direction of travel towards suppression of free speech. I am member of a small group called Holocaust Survivors and Descendants Against the Genocide in Gaza. It's a long title, but that's exactly what we are. And we have banners that we carry with us, hanging from our neck, and sometimes and have one large one as well behind us, pronouncing that we are Jews who are against the genocide and related to a Holocaust indirectly or indirectly. And it's amazing what the big demonstrations where we set ourselves up usually for the big demonstration to march past. The reception towards us is very warm, always. And our point is to undermine the lie that these demonstrations are anti-Semitic, which are not at all. That they are no-go areas of Jews, which is untrue, because we are extremely warmly received and hugged and greeted in affectionate ways. Some people even break down crying. They're so grateful that we make this point. And then we attract a lot of, as you know, attention from media about this. But that is our purpose, and I think it has been working. And also, there is a marching, another large group of Jews, of the so-called Jewish bloc, which marches with the main march. We stand on the side to demonstrate to them that we are not supporting Israel and the Zionists. There was only once that I had a negative reaction. Somebody came up to me and looking at our banners and so on and said, "Shame on you." So I asked this person, "Are you a Zionist?" And he said, "Yes, of course I am." And I said, "Do you support a genocide?" Or the genocide, rather. And he said, "What genocide?" And I said, "Thank you. This discussion terminated." I was not going to argue with somebody or anybody who's seeing what you can see, the immense cruelty and destruction and atrocities, and still doesn't believe it's a genocide.
And this brings me to my final question, although this has been a fairly informative chat. And as a Holocaust survivor and someone standing in solidarity with Palestinians, what is your message to youth around the world and to young Israelis in particular about the moral responsibility in responding to this genocide?
Well, it's what I touched on a bit earlier, that you must not look the other way. Fascism, which is a danger, does not drop out of the sky all of a sudden. It appears in stages, step by step. And it is particularly at the early steps that you got to resist with all your might. And the second message is that there are certain situations when it is compulsory to take risks in order to be on the right side. It's sometimes difficult, but at certain times you just have to do it. And if you don't do it, then there is a degree of guilt involved.
Stephen Kapos, this has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you joining us.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you for
Thank you.
inviting me. And
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Please do stay in touch.
thank you.